It all started like one of those bad jokes you might share with your buddies over a few beers. Hey, ever hear the one about the wife who hooked up with a taxi driver? Sounds absurd, doesn't it? Like something straight out of a cheap adult flick or some trashy daytime soap opera. But this time, it wasn't a joke. No punchline waiting at the end. This was real. It was my life, my marriage, and my wife. Let me rewind for a second. My name's Ethan. I'm just a regular guy in his 30s, nothing fancy. I work in tech as an account manager. It's not the most glamorous gig, but it pays the bills and keeps the lights on. I'm no saint, not by a long shot, but never in a million years did I think I'd be sitting here, writing this. I guess I'm hoping it'll help me make sense of it all, or maybe serve as a warning for someone else down the line. Hell, I don't really know. I've been married to Sophie for 6 years, together for 8. We were solid, or at least I thought we were. No huge fights, no shouting matches. I always took that as a sign things were going well, that we were on stable ground. Maybe that was my first mistake, thinking that just because we weren't constantly at each other's throats, everything was okay. Sophie's, well, she's drop-dead gorgeous. People have been saying that from the start. Whenever we go out, I'd catch folks staring at her, some of them lingering a little too long. At first, it gave me a weird sense of pride, like I'm the guy who gets to take her home. But over time, something shifted. I started feeling like maybe there was more going on that I wasn't catching. We only have one car. Not because we can't afford another. We totally could, but Sophie hates driving. Says it stresses her out. And I get that. So, most of the time, I was the one shuttling her around, to work events, to see her friends, even grocery runs. When I couldn't, she'd call a taxi. In fact, she seemed to prefer that sometimes, like she didn't want to bother me. Looking back, I probably should have paid closer attention to how often she was hopping into cabs. Anyway, that's how we get to that day. I had a meeting downtown. Nothing too special, just another client meeting, but important enough that I needed to be on time. I grabbed my stuff, walked out the door, and headed a few blocks to where we parked our car. You know, one of those annoying city things where parking in front of your own house is a fantasy. It's a bit of a pain, but we got used to it. Except, when I got to the car, the damn thing wouldn't start. I must have sat there for 10 minutes, turning the key over and over, praying for a miracle. No dice. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like I had the faintest clue what I was looking at. Spoiler alert, I didn't. By then, I was already drenched in sweat, and the only option left was to call a tow truck and send it to the shop. Now, I was officially late. Really late. And there was no way I was going to make it downtown by walking or waiting around for the bus. So, I did the only thing I could. I called a taxi. And right there, that's where everything started to unravel. The driver was one of those chatty types. You know the kind. Sees every passenger as a chance for some conversation they think you'll care about. He had this greasy comb-over, shirt half unbuttoned like he couldn't be bothered to dress properly. He gave me a grin in the rearview mirror as I climbed in, clearly eager to get talking. "Busy day, huh?" he asked, catching my eye in the mirror. I gave him a quick nod and a short answer, hoping he'd catch the hint and leave me alone. But of course, he didn't. "You wouldn't believe the stuff I hear from people," he said, his voice grating on my nerves. Man, the stories I could tell. Sometimes, I wonder how folks sleep at night. I tried to tune him out, just staring out the window, but he kept going like I was hanging on every word. "Actually," he continued, "just yesterday, I picked up this woman not far from where I grabbed you. Real looker. She's a regular around there." My gut tightened. That same discomfort I felt yesterday crept up again, but stronger this time. I kept my eyes glued to the passing buildings, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. But something made me listen. A few blocks from my place, it couldn't be Sophie. No way. She's something else, man. He kept going, totally clueless to the tension building in the car. I was hoping I'd see her again today, maybe pick her up at the same spot. You know how it is with regulars. I clenched my jaw. "Why?" I asked, my voice sounding a little too tight. I wasn't even sure why I asked. Maybe I needed to hear what was coming next. Maybe I just couldn't help myself. Part of me still hoped this wasn't what it seemed. He chuckled. like he was about to spill the juiciest piece of gossip. Oh man, it's like something out of a movie. One of those, adult films. I pick her up one day. Normal ride, drop her off at her place. No big deal, right? So I give her the fare, and she's rummaging through this fancy purse, taking her time. Then she looks at me and says she forgot her wallet. My stomach was in knots, my face burning, but I didn't say a word. I couldn't. The driver kept rambling, completely unaware that I was sitting there on the verge of exploding. So, I'm thinking, great, now I've got this situation to deal with. I was about to offer her my number, so she could call me later to settle the fare. I've done that a few times before. Most people eventually pay up. But before I can even get the words out, she leans over and says, "How about I give you a blowjob instead?" The air in the cab got heavy like it was suffocating me. My hands were clenched tight in my lap, my knuckles white as bone. I stared hard at the seat in front of me, trying to make sense of what this guy was saying. This had to be some twisted coincidence, some filthy story that had nothing to do with me. But the way he described her, it was gnawing at me, making it impossible to shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Yeah, man, I couldn't believe it at first. The driver went on, completely oblivious. Like, who the hell offers that instead of paying a cab fare? But she was dead serious. And man, she looked good, real good. So I figured, why not, right? I swallowed hard, the bile rising in my throat. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest, like a drumbeat of betrayal thudding in my ears. She was great too. "Best damn blowjob I've ever had," he said, lowering his voice like he was letting me in on some sleazy secret. And then, get this, afterwards she straight up offers to have sex. Like it was nothing. Of course, I wasn't going to say no to that. My vision blurred with rage, but somehow I kept my voice from shaking too much. Did she tell you her name?" He shrugged, still grinning that lazy, disgusting smile. Man, I didn't care about names. Didn't ask. Didn't seem important, I forced myself to breathe, though every part of me was on the verge of snapping. There was still a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, this was all some awful mix-up. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was just some other woman, some other wife making the same bad choices. But deep down, I had to know. Sensing my hesitation, the driver dropped the final bomb. "Hold on, actually, I think I have a picture of her." "For the memories," he said with a casual grin, like it was no big deal. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out his phone, and started swiping through his photos. I didn't want to see it. God, I didn't want it to be true. But when he finally turned the phone toward me, there was no more denying it. There she was, Sophie, my wife, sitting in the back seat of his cab, smiling like she was in on some kind of sick joke. Her hair was tousled, her cheeks flushed, that same purse, the one I bought for her birthday last year, resting in her lap. It was her, no question. Everything inside me froze. My thoughts, my breath, everything just stopped. In that one horrifying instant, my whole world came crashing down. The driver, still grinning, kept talking, kept laughing like this was just some amusing anecdote to him. But I couldn't hear a word. All I saw was that picture. All I felt was the rage building inside me, the betrayal cutting me to my core. Before I even knew what I was doing, I lunged forward. My fist collided with his face, the impact sending a sharp crack through the air. His yelp of surprise was the only thing that made sense in that moment. His phone flew out of his hand and smacked against the dashboard. I didn't say a word. I threw some money onto the seat, shoved the door open, and stumbled out of the cab, slamming the door behind me. My hands were trembling, my head spinning. Everything around me was a blur of fury and heartbreak. Sophie, my wife, she'd done that, and I had no idea what the hell to do next. That business meeting? It was a complete disaster. Not that I gave a damn. How could I? After what had just gone down in that taxi, work was the last thing on my mind. I barely made it into the conference room, sat through the whole thing like a ghost. Nothing registered. Every time I tried to focus, all I could see was that picture of Sophie, sitting there in that cab, Her hair a mess, her lips swollen, looking like she'd just come back from a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My head was pounding, my pulse hammering in my temples. The clients must have sensed something was off. I caught a few of them exchanging looks, probably wondering what was up with me. Normally, I'm sharp composed. But now, I was just a hollow shell. I stumbled through my notes, gave half-assed answers to their questions, but my mind was gone. By the time it was over, I knew I'd blown it. That deal was as good as dead, but none of it mattered. Not anymore. I left the building in a daze, my thoughts spiraling out of control. What the hell had just happened? How had my life gone from normal, stable, hell, even boring, to this? To being that guy, the one whose wife screwed a freaking taxi driver for a fare? And not just cheated, but humiliated herself, offering sexual favors like she was starring in some trashy adult film. The anger, the betrayal, the sheer humiliation, it was all swirling inside me, and I had no idea how to deal with it. But then gradually my anger started to solidify. It wasn't just raw pain anymore. It was morphing into something darker, more determined. I wasn't content with just feeling hurt. I wanted her to feel the same pain, the same devastation. No way in hell was I going to sit back and become some sad, pitiful, broken husband everyone felt sorry for. No, I was going to get my revenge. She wasn't walking away from this unscathed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced a million miles an hour. Every memory of our relationship played in my head on repeat. Every kiss, every time she smiled at me and said she loved me. It all felt like one giant, cruel lie now. Like our whole life together had been some kind of sick illusion. And the more I dwelled on it, the angrier I got. At some point, I got up and wandered into the living room. I paced back and forth, my mind churning with thoughts of revenge. I couldn't let her get away with this. I wouldn't let her get away with this. But how? How could I make her pay? I wasn't going to let this slide. Then it hit me. Sophie was obsessed with her image. She thrived on the way people saw her. The perfect, successful wife with the perfect, charming husband. Her friends and colleagues all saw her as this poised, beautiful woman who had it all together. And I knew exactly how to tear that perfect image apart. The first thing I did was file for divorce. Cold, calculated, no warning. I wasn't going to give her the opportunity to explain herself or cry and beg for forgiveness. I didn't want her thinking there was even a shred of hope for us. I wanted her blindsided, just like I had been. I wanted her to wake up and find her whole world collapsing around her. The very next day, I contacted a lawyer. I didn't say a word to her about it. I didn't drop a single hint. I just quietly started laying the groundwork. I knew where to hit her where it would hurt the most. I'd take the house, our savings, everything she thought was hers. I wasn't the nice guy anymore. She had wrecked our marriage, and I was going to make sure she paid dearly for it. But it wasn't just about the material things. No, I wanted to destroy her reputation too. I thought about that picture the taxi driver had of her. If I could get my hands on that, I could expose her for who she really was. I could show her friends, her co-workers, everyone, the truth about the kind of person she really was. She'd be humiliated, just like she had humiliated me. As I sat in my lawyer's office, going over the details, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. I was taking control. I wasn't going to be the victim anymore. Not by a long shot. The lawyer scribbled down notes as we went over the process, each step bringing me closer to my goal. It all felt so cold, so methodical. But I didn't care. This was war. When I finally told Sophie, she didn't see it coming. She came home from work, chatting about her day like nothing was wrong, completely clueless that her life was about to be flipped upside down. "Sophie," I said, my voice steady, "we need to talk." She looked at me confused. There was no guilt, no shame on her face. She had no idea what was coming. I handed her the divorce papers, my heart ice cold. Her face went pale, and she stammered, What is this?" "I'm filing for divorce," I said flatly. "I know what you've been doing." She froze, her eyes wide, panic starting to creep into her expression. Ethan, wait, what do you mean? What are you talking about? I couldn't even look at her. The anger boiling inside me was too much. Don't play dumb, Sophie. I know. About the taxi driver. About what you did. Her face crumbled, and she reached out, her voice shaking. No, Ethan, it's not what you think. I cut her off before she could even finish. Save it. I don't care what you have to say. My mind's already made up. And with that, I walked out, leaving her standing there, clutching the divorce papers like they were a death sentence. She thought she could cheat, lie, and still go on pretending everything was fine. But she was dead wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Revenge was my fuel now. I'd always seen myself as the calm, rational type. But after what Sophie had done, that version of me was gone, buried under layers of betrayal and humiliation. Now, the only thing that made sense was making her pay. And I wouldn't stop until I tore her whole world apart. Step one was just getting started. The divorce papers were only the beginning. Sophie had been shocked when I handed them to her, pale as a ghost, eyes wide with disbelief. But she hadn't seen anything yet. I was about to strip away everything she held dear. Istorted vitemone. You know the saying, revenge is a dish best served cold? Well, that's exactly how I played it. One morning, before she even knew what was happening, I drained our joint bank account. Every last penny transferred into my personal account. Sophie barely even glanced at our finances. She'd always relied on me to handle everything. So, when she tried to use her card that day and it got declined, that was the first shock. I got a text from her, filled with confusion, asking why her card wasn't working. I didn't respond. I let her stew in her panic. That was just the beginning of what was coming her way. Next, I began planting seeds of doubt among Sophie's friends. She had always been obsessed with how others saw her, constantly working to maintain the image of the perfect wife, the woman who had it all together. She'd spent years crafting that pristine persona, but I knew exactly how to dismantle it. I started by casually talking to a few of her closest friends, dropping subtle hints about our marriage. Just enough to make them wonder. Yeah, Sophie and I are going through a bit of a rough patch. I'd say with just the right touch of vulnerability. But I don't really want to get into the details. Of course, that vague admission only fueled their curiosity. People thrive on gossip, especially when it involves a seemingly perfect couple. It didn't take long for the rumors to begin swirling. Sophie had always been so meticulous about controlling her narrative, but I was unraveling it piece by piece, one casual conversation at a time. But the real heart of my revenge, the part that kept me up at night planning, centered around that damn picture. The one the taxi driver had taken of Sophie in the back seat, smiling like it was all a game. That image haunted me, but I also knew it was the key to breaking her down. Divorce wasn't enough. I wasn't going to just walk away. No, I was going to humiliate her, just like she had humiliated me. I tracked down the taxi driver. I got his name during that fateful ride, and after a little digging, I found out more about him. Surprisingly, I didn't even need to threaten him. He was more than happy to talk. To him, Sophie was just another conquest, a story to boast about to his buddies. He handed over the picture without hesitation. "Do whatever you want with it, man," he said, grinning like the sleazy dirtbag he was. "She's your problem now." Holding that photo in my hand, I felt a cold wave of satisfaction wash over me. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but I knew it was necessary. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back control of my life, reclaiming my dignity. Sophie wasn't going to walk away from this untouched. I started with her job. Sophie worked at a fancy marketing firm, constantly going on about how important reputation was in her line of work. She'd built her career on being seen as polished and professional, untouchable even. So I decided to send that picture, along with an anonymous note, to a few key people at her company. Her boss, HR, and a couple of coworkers she was close to. I didn't add any explanation. I let the image speak for itself. I could almost picture the chaos it would create. Sophie walking into work completely clueless until the whispers began, until her boss called her into his office, holding that picture in his hand. The shame, the humiliation, it was exactly what she deserved. She'd turned me into a fool, and now it was her turn to experience that same crushing humiliation. But I didn't stop there. No, this was just the beginning. Sophie had a close-knit social circle, always hosting dinner parties and weekend getaways where she paraded herself as the perfect wife. I made sure her friends saw that picture too. A few anonymous emails, a couple of strategically placed social media posts. Nothing too blatant, just enough to make sure they started seeing her for who she really was. The fallout was immediate. I didn't hear from Sophie directly for a few days after I served her with the divorce papers and drained our account. But I knew the whispers were growing. I could tell from the frantic texts she started sending me, the missed calls piling up on my phone. She was spiraling, trying to figure out what was going on, but I ignored her. I wanted her to feel the panic, the loss of control. Then about a week after I sent that picture out, she showed up at my door. It was late, well after dark. I was sitting in the living room with a drink in my hand when I heard the knock. I knew it was her before I even opened the door. When I did, there she was standing on the porch looking like she had been through hell. Her eyes were swollen and red from crying, her hair a mess, and there was this desperate, broken look on her face. "Ethan, please," she choked out. "We need to talk." I leaned against the doorframe, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To see her like this, broken, finally facing the consequences of what she'd done. "Talk," I said, my voice cool. "About what?" "About all of this," she stammered, waving her hand vaguely. Her voice shook with emotion. "The divorce, the money. Ethan, I don't understand why you're doing this. We can work this out." I let out a bitter laugh. "Work this out? You think we could just work this out after what you did?" Her face crumpled, and the tears started flowing again. "I made a mistake, okay? I'm sorry. But this is too far, Ethan. Why are you trying to ruin my life?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice, filled with all the anger I'd been holding back. "Ruin your life? You ruined mine, Sophie. You made me into a joke. You betrayed me, humiliated me, and now you want me to just move on? No, you don't get to walk away from this clean. You don't get to pretend like nothing happened." Her sobs grew louder, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something, sympathy maybe, but it was quickly swallowed by the anger that had been festering inside me since the day I found out. "You didn't just cheat, Sophie," I continued, my voice icy. "You destroyed everything. And now it's your turn to face the music." She stood there on the porch, broken, pleading, but I was done listening. She broke down, and for a fleeting second, I almost felt something. Maybe it was sympathy, maybe pity. But then that damn image flashed in my mind, the one of her grinning in the back of that cab after what she'd done. Whatever shred of compassion I might have felt disappeared in an instant. "This is just the start," I said coldly, the anger hardening in my voice. "You're going to know what it feels like to lose everything." I slammed the door in her face, her sobbing echoing through the night. The divorce was a complete bloodbath, just as I had intended. By the time the dust settled, Sophie's life was in shambles. The woman who used to strut around like she owned the world, the one who always had everything perfectly under control, had been reduced to a shadow of who she once was. I walked away with the house, most of the savings, and even a chunk of her retirement. The court didn't care about who cheated. They just divided things up by the book. But Sophie? She cared. She cared a hell of a lot, and so did everyone else who knew her. The fallout hit harder than I even imagined. Once that picture started making the rounds at her job, it was only a matter of time before whispers turned into full-blown gossip. Her spotless reputation crumbled almost overnight. She lost the respect of her colleagues and her boss. Even if they didn't know every detail, they knew enough. Sophie had been obsessed with her image for as long as I'd known her, and I took that away from her. That was the real prize, the house, the money. That was just a bonus. What I really wanted was to destroy her pride, her reputation. And I did. Her friends turned on her too. People love watching someone fall from grace. And she became the train wreck they couldn't look away from. The same people who used to flock to her at parties, who marveled at her perfect life, started distancing themselves. At first it was subtle, but soon enough, they all backed away. It wasn't just the cheating that did her in. It was the scandal, the humiliation. Sophie became a joke, a cautionary tale whispered about over wine and dinner. I knew her well enough to understand that being the outcast, the subject of pity and ridicule, was worse for her than any physical punishment could ever be. As for me, surprisingly, most people took my side. When news broke that we were getting divorced, I didn't have to say much. I let people draw their own conclusions. The picture spoke volumes. Friends, colleagues, they reached out, offering their sympathy, expressing their shock over what I had been through. Even the ones who had been close to Sophie didn't know what to say to her anymore. She had become radioactive, and I could see her world falling apart in real time. But after the divorce was finalized, something inside me shifted. The thrill of revenge had faded. Maybe it was the empty house, the quiet that felt too loud, or the realization that I didn't have anything left to fight for. I had been so focused on destroying her that I hadn't thought about what would come next. My rage had driven me for so long, but once it was all over, I felt empty. I couldn't stay in that city any longer. Every corner, every familiar street was a reminder of her, of us, of everything I had lost, even though I was the one who burned it all down. The memories, both good and bad, were too much to bear. I had to get out, had to start fresh. So I did. I packed up what I needed, sold the house, and moved to a new city. A clean slate, I told myself, somewhere no one knew my story, where I could just be Ethan, without the shadow of my messy divorce hanging over me. It wasn't easy. It still isn't. Some mornings, I wake up and wonder if I took things too far. Maybe I should have handled it differently. Maybe I didn't have to tear her life apart. But then I remember that day in the taxi, seeing that picture of her smiling after everything, and the guilt fades away. Moving wasn't just about leaving her behind. It was about escaping everything. The people, the places, the life I thought I had. I needed to rebuild, to figure out who I was without the weight of all that anger dragging me down. It's still a work in progress, but I'm getting there. Slowly, step by step. So, here I am, in a new city, trying to figure out what comes next. I've got my own space now, my own quiet. And for the first time in a long while, I don't have her betrayal hanging over me like a dark cloud every second of the day. I'm not sure where life will take me from here, but at least I'm no longer stuck in the past. If you've made it this far, thanks for sticking with me. It's been a wild ride, and now that it's all out there, I'm curious. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have sought revenge the way I did, or just walked away? Maybe I went too far. Maybe I didn't go far enough. I'm still not sure, but I guess we all handle betrayal in our own way. Anyway, that's my story. Thanks for listening. Update. It's been over 6 months since the divorce, and life has moved on, though not in the way I expected. Going through all that, the revenge, the divorce, trying to rebuild myself, it feels like running through mud. Every step forward feels harder than it should, and some days I question if I'm making any progress at all. In the first few months after everything, I buried myself in work. I needed the distraction, something to keep my mind busy and drown out all the noise in my head. I got a new job, just like I said before, but the transition hasn't been as smooth as I hoped. I went from handling big accounts in a corporate world to working for a smaller startup. It's a lot less pressure, but the learning curve is steeper than I expected. New faces, new responsibilities, and most of all, a new version of myself trying to figure out how to exist without the constant weight of Sophie's betrayal. Life's not perfect, but it's moving, and I guess that's something. At first, I embraced the change. The atmosphere at the startup felt like a breath of fresh air compared to the stiff, corporate world I had been trapped in for years. I had more freedom, more hands-on involvement with clients, and I got to help shape projects in ways I hadn't before. It felt liberating, but then there were those moments, Moments when a random song, a scent, or even something as simple as a phrase a colleague said would suddenly yank me back into memories of her. Memories I was doing my best to forget. I've had to excuse myself from meetings more than once just to get a grip, to push those thoughts back down before they overwhelmed me. It wasn't just work either. The loneliness crept in, though I tried to hide it. After the divorce, I convinced myself I was ready to move on, maybe even try dating again. But that was just a lie I told myself, a way to feel like I was making progress. The truth was, I wasn't ready. Not even close. I signed up for a couple of dating apps, swiped through profiles, messaged a few women. I even went on one date. It was a disaster. We sat across from each other, trying to make small talk over coffee, but the entire time, I felt like I was playing a role, pretending to be someone I wasn't, someone who wasn't broken. The woman was nice enough, but every time I looked at her, all I could think was, what's the point? What's she hiding? It was a short date, and I knew I wasn't ready to try again anytime soon. The scars Sophie left weren't just about the betrayal itself. They were about trust. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust someone the same way again. Every time I imagine opening myself up to someone new, I think about how easily Sophie slipped into someone else's bed, how she didn't even hesitate. The lies, the manipulation, it's left a mark I'm still struggling to make sense of. In the midst of all this, I still hear things about Sophie. It's inevitable. We still have a few mutual friends. Well, more like acquaintances now. And every so often, someone feels the need to update me on her situation. They tell me she's struggling. Apparently, she lost her job not long after the divorce was finalized, and her reputation in the industry took a nosedive. Word is, she hasn't been able to find steady work since, and she's been bouncing between jobs, living with her sister. At first, I thought knowing she was suffering would bring me some kind of satisfaction. I used to picture her losing everything, just like I had, and I thought that would make me feel better. But when I heard she was barely keeping it together, I didn't feel anything. No joy, no relief, just emptiness. I guess I had convinced myself that ruining her life would fix mine. But it doesn't work that way, does it? There's no real satisfaction in someone else's suffering, not when it comes at the cost of your own peace of mind. Sure, I'm still angry. I'm still hurt. But hearing about her downfall, it felt hollow, like none of it mattered anymore. I had already won the battle, but the war inside me? That was far from over. A couple of months ago, I ran into one of her old friends at a bar. It was awkward, to say the least. She tried to avoid talking about Sophie at first, but after a couple of drinks, she leaned in and said, "You know, she's not doing great, Ethan. She really messed up." I just nodded, pretending to care, but the truth is I tuned most of it out. Sophie wasn't my problem anymore. She wasn't my concern. But there was one thing that stuck with me. Apparently, Sophie had tried to reach out a few times, not directly to me, but through mutual friends. She wanted to know if I'd be open to talking, to finding some kind of closure. Closure? After everything she'd done? That's the thing about people like her. They think they can wrap things up neatly, put a bow on the wreckage they've caused, and walk away. But I've learned that not everything gets closure. Some wounds stay open, no matter how hard you try to move on. That's why I had to leave that city. It felt suffocating. Every street, every familiar spot reminded me of her, of us, and of everything I had lost. Moving was a necessity, a way to escape not just her, but the life we had built together. I've been in this new city for a few months now, and while it's been an adjustment, there's something peaceful about the anonymity. No one here knows my story. No one knows about the divorce or the scandal or the mess I left behind. I get to live without the weight of people's pity or their judgment. There's still a lot I haven't figured out. I'm not sure when, if ever, I'll be ready to let someone else into my life again. But for now, I'm focusing on the small things. Building a routine, throwing myself into work, trying to live without letting the past drag me down. It's not perfect, and there are days when it feels like I'm just going through the motions, but it's better than it was before. People always say time heals everything, but I've realized that's not exactly true. Time doesn't heal, it just quiets things. The pain becomes less raw, the memories a little less sharp. But they're still there, lurking under the surface. So here I am, in this new chapter of my life. Not healed, not whole, but maybe a little less broken than I was. And I suppose that's something.